Good evening. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, students, faculty, and staff of the University of Dallas, and with thanks to the Museum of Biblical Art for their hospitality, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. It's my honor and privilege to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Dr. Carolyn Bruzelius. Dr. Bruzelius earned her doctorate at Yale and is the Anne M. Cogan Professor of Art History at Duke University. She is a renowned art historian who specializes in medieval monastic architecture. While one of her main research focuses is the impact of the Franciscan and Dominican monastic orders on the architecture of medieval cities, she is also the founder of Duke University's Wired and Visualizing Venice projects. These initiatives integrate digital technology into teaching and research. The Wired group has completed projects such as using laser scanning and animation to reconstruct the locations of ancient structures and to reflect on the transportation of precious materials in antiquity. Dr. Bruzelius has published numerous books, and most recently, she published Preaching, Building, and Burying Friars in Medieval Cities, which investigates how religious orders dedicated to apostolic poverty were able to create large-scale monastic complexes within crowded medieval cities. From 1994 to 1998, Dr. Bruzelius served as the director of the American Academy of Art. We are pleased to be able to share Dr. Bruzelius' visit to the University of Dallas with the larger Dallas community, and in particular with the museum that has been such a supporter and collaborator with the university over the years. I'm almost done. It's only appropriate that the Phi Beta Kappa Society would choose the University of Dallas to be one of the hosts for their Visiting Scholars Program. In 1989, the University of Dallas became the youngest university in the 20th century to receive Phi Beta Kappa status. Phi Beta Kappa commitment to recognizing academic excellence in the liberal arts and sciences at American universities and the University of Dallas's unique core curriculum in the liberal arts were a natural partnership. Thank you to the Phi Beta Kappa Society Visiting Scholars Program. We have been delighted to have Dr. Bruzelius on campus for the last 2 days, meeting informally with students, faculty members, and participating in classroom discussions and giving public lectures. Now, without further ado, it is my great honor to present to you Dr. Carolyn Bruzelius.
It is my great honor to be here after spending a day and a half at the University of Dallas and being completely dazzled by the quality of the faculty and the students. Everybody's so intelligent. And it's going to be a real disappointment to go back home to my university now. I don't quite know how I'm going to cope. But I also am thrilled to be here at the Biblical Museum, and I want to thank the director, Scott Peck, and also Dr. Tom Keefe, and my wonderful hosts at the University of Dallas, Dr. Rover and Dr. Short. This has been a great visit, and I hope it's not going to end badly. I hope this will also be okay. So I also want to just say a very personal thing. I'm a very lucky person, not only because I've had a chance to visit you, but also because I work on amazing material. I'm one of those strange people who spend their lives crawling up and down big buildings like this one and asking questions about how they were built, why they look the way they do. And of course I get kind of dirty from time to time because there's not a lot of dusting goes on. Maybe at the end I will show you some dusting of Church Cathedral, which is quite controversial. But how lucky I am to have had a thrilling life in scholarship and research on perhaps the most beautiful buildings in the world. And in fact, I think there can be no more exalted expression of human aspiration and human skill than these remarkable cathedrals. They soar, as Chartres does, over cities today, same way they did in the 16th century and before. Here you have a view of Chartres taken from the countryside when the city was still tidily enclosed in its walls. But cathedrals have not always had an easy life. As you probably know, in the French Revolution, many of them were secularized, and a good many were torn down completely. I'm showing you here, by the way, can you hear me all right? This is good. I'm showing you here a picture of the Cathedral of Cambrai in the north of France, which was completely destroyed. Look at how beautiful this must have been, with these remarkable windows. And imagine the sculpture and the paintings and all the decoration that we simply don't know anything about. Other cathedrals in the north of France, which were particularly vulnerable to the revolution, that were entirely destroyed, were the cathedrals of Arras and Valenciennes. And we actually have images of destruction taking place. In fact, in many instances, these cathedrals were used as quarries. That is to say, the materials were dismantled, wood, stone, right, and used for building purposes. So here in Paris, you have to imagine that Paris had, many, many dozens more medieval churches than it does today. And here we have what were called the bandes noires, black bands. These people who made money by tearing down buildings, and here are all the building parts of this particular church. Well, if the 19th century was bad, the 20th century was worse. And particularly because of the two world wars, World War I, and you see here direct bombardment of Reims Cathedral, which resulted in this kind of destruction of the interior, tragic loss of stained glass, massive, the roof burned off, the bolts blown through, the windows blown through too. I might say that the restoration of Reims Cathedral was in large measure due to American contributions after the war, and the Carnegie family in particular. And that wasn't the end of it, because as you know, although we don't often talk about it, the invasion of Normandy also entailed the bombardment of cities. And here you have a view of the city of Caen in Normandy. The city is largely burned and destroyed, and the church is not so damaged, I'm glad to say. Now, it's not just buildings, even though they seem permanent, even though they are majestic. It's not just buildings that have undergone such damage and loss. It is also the many sacred objects that were in those buildings. And maybe it's particularly fitting that I'm giving this lecture here in this museum, which is full of sacred objects, right? But if you think back to medieval churches, they would have been packed with painted altarpieces, with painted sculpture, with tombs, with flags, with shields. And this image, which is from the Reformation, shows these fellows taking down sculptures, dismantling them, breaking them, taking down altar panels and paintings, and burning them. Imagine how many things have been lost as a result of that kind of Reformation, that is 16th century destruction, right, in the north. And then, of course, in the French Revolution, we had the destruction of sculpture, stained glass windows. And here we have at Lyon Cathedral in on the Rhone, I'm sorry. We have a wonderful image, or a tragic image, of sculpture being torn off the facade of the cathedral. If you go to Lyon today, you will see no sculpture. This picture is like a photograph that shows that sculpture being knocked off and demolished. There's another kind of loss, though, and that's the loss that I'm going to focus on in my talk to you, and that is the organic relationship between the cathedral and the city it was located in. Because nowadays, when we look at cathedrals, we often perceive them as isolated monuments without the entire complex that surrounded them. And so today, I really want to think about how the cathedral connected with the city, or didn't, as you'll see sometimes, and also think about this as part of a large setting out of ecclesiastical structures that had multiple functions. And those functions were central to the meaning of the cathedral. So here we are back at Chartres Cathedral, looking at it from the south side. But when we look at a map of Chartres, the medieval city, what we see is that the cathedral, which is right here, was actually located in a walled precinct. That is to say that the cathedral and the ancillary buildings were totally enclosed in a wall that had gates into it. So this part of the city of Chartres could be closed off in a way that we have completely lost nowadays. And what's more, that precinct was very close to another closed precinct that has completely been destroyed too, and that is the chateau, the castle of the Count of Chartres. And the dynamic relationships between ecclesiastical authority in the form of the bishop and the canons of the cathedral was often in rather sharp and intense conflict with the authority of the Count only a block away. So we have to imagine that what is a peaceful and beautiful town nowadays actually in the Middle Ages had moments of very complicated negotiations over a series of rights to different things, to tax, to run the courts, and so on. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. If we go into the enclave, into the precinct itself, what we see is that the precinct also had separate divisions and different quarters. The bishop had the best place at Chartres, the highest point, where now you see an 18th century plan with beautiful gardens here and here, right? The bishop's palace was located right here, right over a sharp cliff that goes down to the river below the town. So a very beautiful site for the bishop indeed. And then on the other side, we have the houses and the quarters and the meeting rooms of the canons. Right? The canons are the clergy who are associated with the cathedral. Each one of them is like a chaired professor. There is an income associated with each of them, which in the Middle Ages was called a prebend. And a prebend consisted of a piece of land, or many pieces of land, that provided the income that would support that particular clergyman, the canon, in his job. Now, a cathedral like Chartres might have 100, 120 canons. Right? So you can imagine that the aggregate of agricultural property and houses associated with each of these chaired professorships, right, would have been quite considerable. The bishop had the same kind of income source, and that's quite interesting. Now, that's not all that we have here. We also have part of the precinct that is a hospital, a very extensive hospital. And then we had houses that would serve the needs of pilgrims, right? So there might be cafes and bars and restaurants. There might be hospices and places they could stay. There might be places where they might buy trinkets or pilgrims badges that they could sew on their hats or their cloaks to say that they had made the pilgrimage to Chartres. So a kind of commercial quarter, which, however, was inside the gated precinct. Here's a gate, here's another gate, here's another gate, gated precinct of the cathedral. They even had their own granary, which is here, an enormous structure, which I'm happy to say still survives and is a magnificent 13th century structure. So if you go to Chartres, you must go see the granary of the Loens, as it's called, which is over here. Now, divisions of space, and even what we might call hierarchies of space, also existed inside the cathedral. When you go to a cathedral today, you see one long big space, but in the Middle Ages, it was divided up. And in fact, the clergy had their own separate zone here, the liturgical choir, which was separate and walled off from the rest of the cathedral. That meant that the clergy could say the liturgical offices, could say their prayers without the noise and chaos of pilgrims disturbing them, for example. And you can see here a reconstruction of the rather significant architectural structure, right here, right, that separated off the public's part of the church and the liturgical part of the church. So zoning and separation were endemic to these buildings and to the spaces around them in very interesting ways. Now I'm going to show you a terrific example of this kind of thing, because I don't know if anybody here has been to eastern France, very near the German border. There's a beautiful cathedral at a place called Metz. And here you have a view of the inside. The fact is, though, that this cathedral had, until the 19th century, a separate section completely closed off, which was the parish church. So the building that you see here was entirely for the use of the canons and for pilgrims coming to look at the relics and their shrines on the altars. But when it came to parochial activities, when it came to the community, they had a separate part of the church, and that's the area that I've sort of shown here in this little box, just to indicate, here I ask you to peel your eyes and look hard, to indicate that the supports, right here you see we have these complicated supports, complicated. Once we get to the layman's part of the church, the parish church, they become simple tubes, right? They are simple columns. So, in fact, if I reconstruct how that looked, what we had was a parish church, completely separate, with a wall between it, and then we had the bishops and the canons church here. So we had a church for the public, a layman's church, with its own priest, who was not a canon, right, who was separate, and then we had the cathedral with its chapels and altars and relics and so on. So it's not as though the cathedral was closed to the public, but it really was primarily for the use of the hierarchy of the church. And that little parish church had its own altar and its own apse located right here. And here's a picture of it, looking into that little parish church, which once was sort of closed off or semi-closed off from the rest of the cathedral. So cathedrals had these separate sections, and it's something we don't see anymore because those divisions have been taken away. Now here's a really fantastic cathedral in Switzerland, the Cathedral of Lausanne, which is, as you see, a very beautiful building, begun around 1130, 1140, and then built quite slowly. When we look into the building, again, we see one long stretch of a very beautiful Gothic space. And now we're looking back towards the west end of the church, where nowadays a very marvelous organ has been placed against the west facade. But in fact, before that organ, until the mid-19th century, there was a road. There was a road that enabled the townspeople to get from their houses to the market. So here we have a plan. Here's the cathedral, here's the west facade, and the towers, here's the road. The road went right through the cathedral. It sliced it in half. So in fact, this diagram shows that really well. Here's the west facade with its towers, right? Here's the road, going right up to the market, which was located up here. Really quite remarkable. And one artist has reconstructed what that passageway would have looked like, right? So the cathedral's over here, and the towers are over here, and here's that passageway. We don't want to ask our burghers to go circumnavigate, but eventually, after the 19th century, they had to do that, right? They couldn't walk through the cathedral anymore. People thought it was a little bit indecent to have this kind of road through the building, so you had to circumnavigate and go up to the market in this particular way. Oh, well, that's really very interesting because it suggests all sorts of different kinds of relationships, right, between the town and the cathedral structure and the cathedral hierarchy. Now, I'd like to talk about one of my very favorite buildings, which is the Cathedral of Noyon. It's not a place that most people go, but I urge you to go there. It's a very old-fashioned French town with a Hôtel de la Poste, where you can get a good 10-course lunch. So bottles of wine. And in the 16th century, the Cathedral of Noyon looked like this. Coming up above the city walls, you can see them here. You see the other churches, some of them abbeys, some of them parish churches with their towers. And this cathedral, even though it's rather small by later standards, is in a very wealthy, very bountiful part of France, and Picardy. Here is Noyon inside my circle. It's right on the river Oise. that goes down to the Seine River, that goes right down to Paris. It was also really close to the English Channel. And if you know anything about medieval trade, you know that the wool trade from England was coming down into France precisely, into the towns along the edge here, and bringing great wealth for the treatment of that wool, the weaving of that wool, the dyeing of that wool, and then selling it in the fairs of Champagne, which are over here. So rivers, roads, being near ports, all that made the Bishop of Noyon a rather wealthy man. But in addition, the land in which the Cathedral of Noyon is situated, this beautiful, flowing French farmland, which is wonderful for growing wheat, other grains. You can see it here. Underneath that wonderful farmland, there is great limestone. And you can't really build a good cathedral unless you have good stone, right? Stone that you can carve and shape precisely into beautifully formed blocks. So with this financial resource and with this stone, the Bishop of Noyon, beginning around 1140, we actually don't know for sure, built this very elegant, small, early Gothic cathedral. You look at a slide of it and it looks quite nifty and well organized. But in fact, there are a series of things about this cathedral, and I could spend the whole rest of the year talking about different parts of it. But I'm going to talk about just one thing, and that is the way this cathedral was built into the old city, which was surrounded by Roman protective walls that were put up as the Roman Empire was decaying and losing its ability to protect its cities. The Roman cities were walled. And those walls became, in towns like Noyon, kind of girdles that tightly constrained the growth of the city, even as population began to expand and grow. So if we look at a map of Noyon, we see here the old Roman wall. We call it Gallo-Roman because it's late Roman. That's this dotted line here. We even have the old Roman north-south street, the Cardo, cutting right through. Here is the cathedral at number 1. And the old building, I'm going to show you another diagram. The old building was here at location A, inside the wall, which was right here. But when this bishop, around 1140, wants to expand his cathedral, he can't stay within that old wall, right? He can't build this big new building inside there. So he has to jump over the wall and build the new east end, right? The new altar area outside, beyond the wall, right? And that's what you see, to go back to this diagram, that's what you see here. You have the new part built on a new foundation, and then connects with the old part. Now, we have some kids here in the audience, so let's enlist them in taking a good hard look at this. When you look at the cathedral at A, and you look at the straight line that goes through the middle, and then you look at the new cathedral, and you look at the line that cuts through the middle here, are they on the same axis? Are they on the same line? No, they are not. Because they were building the new cathedral outside the wall. They were getting it ready before they tore down the old cathedral. They have to keep on having services. So in fact, when we look at a plan of this cathedral, it's banana-shaped. You can see that it has this curve in it, right? Because this part was built outside the wall. Wall went right through here. This is over the old part. They maybe even reused the old foundation. So they had two axes that weren't quite in agreement. Now, I could talk a lot about this building, and I could say how they kept changing their mind about what they wanted to build. You know, a long, complicated story. However, the net effect is that when we look at this cathedral, we see a very harmonious, right? A completely charming and delightful early Gothic building. So, here's a good question. Bishop Simon of Vermontois, who is the bishop who starts this cathedral, is in his own right a wealthy man. He's a cousin of the King of France. He's from the highest nobility. But to build a building is really very expensive. And it's interesting, I think, to think about this kind of project and what kind of resources would have been necessary to make it happen. And I'm particularly talking about this because President Keefe is here, and he needs some help supporting his university. So let me give him some instruction. For example, he was a peer of France, that is, he was a cousin of the king. I don't know if our president can claim that, but he was also bishop of another diocese. So, in fact, two dioceses have been joined together in this particular instance. He got income from all the lands, and I explained that before, how the clergy were supported by property and the serfs who were working on the property. But he also got income from lots of town and trade-based activities. So he could tax the guilds, the shoemakers, the cloth weavers, the fur coat makers, whatever it happens to be. He could also tax forts and bridges. He was actually what we call a bishop count. So he had complete authority, complete feudal authority over his domain. So if he wants to put a tax on a road, he puts a tax on a road, or a bridge, or a gate to the city. Very nice. And he can tax mills and wine presses. I don't know if you have those here. And he can put tolls on the main roads. And these are roads very important, as I pointed out. The trade routes that bring the wool from England down to the fairs of Champagne. He can put tolls on rivers and bridges, and he can establish favorable, that's bad spelling, I'm sorry, favorable rates for currency. So one important detail here is that every medieval town had its own coinage. So just imagine that if you're going from Fort Worth to Dallas, right, you have to exchange money. And then you're coming to visit me in North Carolina and we have different coinage. Well, the bishop had the monopoly on exchanges and could set them to his own benefit. And then, most importantly, he had the courts, right? So anybody who had to pay a traffic violation, right, to pay for a new license for their car or whatever it happened to be, went to the bishop's courts. And we will see some examples of that and its consequences in a moment. There are other kinds of income, Mr. President, that I would like to bring to your attention. You could charge a tax on all merchandise sold. Well, we do that in North Carolina, actually, right? You can tax all carts that carry goods to market, okay? Some bishops will even tax the number of wheels. You can tax money changing. You can do this thing called jouage, which is the right to regulate weights and measures, and that can be done to your benefit. You can take from the market fruits and vegetables at no cost. Very nice. Fresh vegetables. You have the right to buy animals and meat at the price that you set. Justice, tolls on rivers, and then the farms. Right, quite significant. And it's all this together that is going to enable our French bishops to build the most beautiful buildings we've ever seen, right? Buildings like Sens Cathedral, and we're looking at the facade of it here. One of the most remarkable buildings, about 127 feet tall, begun in 1210. Extraordinary decoration of the stained glass windows. The towers are so light and lacy that you can look right through them. The gables on the portals come rising upwards and pierce into the rose window. It's just a remarkable and breathtaking composition. It's a composition for a bishop who was part of a very significant and enormous complex of buildings that took over, I would say, maybe 1/5 or 1/6 of the ancient city of Sens. And here you see a map of Sens. Here's the Gallo Roman wall, the late antique wall, late 4th century. So it's an important Roman town. The cathedral complex occupies this part in pink. Later on, in the Middle Ages, the population is going to expand exponentially. We're going to have many more people. We have better climate, we have better food, we have a population boom when this cathedral is being built that isn't going to be matched until the late 19th century. Quite remarkable. And then we have a complex of the cathedral that is recorded in this engraving here that actually shows how it looked in the 18th century. A whole complex of buildings attached to the cathedral. Let me show you a few diagrams that make it a little bit clearer. Here's our cathedral with its beautiful facade. This whole area in purple, which is quite enormous, is where the houses of the canons were, about 140 at the Cathedral of Sens. And this orange area is where the bishop had his palace and his gardens. And this green area is the hospital, right down here. And in fact, the association of cathedrals and hospitals is really a very beautiful thing. Because as you can probably imagine, healthcare in the Middle Ages, maybe not so great. Maybe we're glad to be living in the 21st century. But the saints were powerfully important in healthcare, right? It was the benevolent action of the saints evoked through prayer who helped you when you were ill. And so being near the cathedral, where the bodies of the saints were believed to be in the Middle Ages, actively present, right, in the relics of the altars, was really very important. So almost always, in front of a cathedral, you have a hospital. Sometimes it's larger, sometimes it's smaller, but at Sens here, you can see it was quite enormous. Luckily, we have an engraving of Sens Cathedral that was made in the 16th century. And here we see, and I've put a red box around it, all the area that belonged to the canons, the clergy of the cathedral, right? Each one had a little house. And those houses had gardens. Of course, they had servants and they had helpers. And so we have a sort of whole village within the city that is made up, and that's called the chapitre, right? The canons, choir, right? And the chapitre owns all these houses, and it also owns this whole area here, which includes the treasury that abutted the cathedral. They have a cloister, and most remarkably, they have the prison du chapitre, the prisons of the chapter, right? So they also clearly have legal jurisdiction over some of the population, and they have their own courts. The bishop, whose palace is here, also has his prison. Interesting. So what we might have is a situation of, in fact, several different courts that are run by the chapter, by the bishop, their own place to put people who refuse to behave. And this legal component to the cathedral precinct is really very important. I'm going to show you another example, because we don't have anything like this anywhere else I know, but at Strasbourg, off the south transept of the church, we actually have a space that served as the law courts outside. And there's a statue of Solomon right here, and a statue of the church triumphant here, synagogue defeated here, and the decoration of this portal, which happily was well preserved in spite of the revolution, really evokes that idea of judgment through those figures that decorate this portal. I imagine, but I don't know for sure, that in bad weather the law court wasn't outside but inside the transept. And that brings up the idea that a lot of these activities, such as juridical activities, could have taken place and often did take place inside the cathedral. So, go back to Sens. We have this remarkable building that I was talking about. But what's so interesting to me was that its construction must have put stress on the town. It's such an ambitious building. It's so magnificent and so huge that there was a rather complicated relationship between the aristocratic bishop, also closely related to the royal family, and the townspeople who were workers like you and me, well, at least like me, people who were in the town, people who had little houses, people who were often in the trades. So for this cathedral, we have a situation where the building is begun in 1210 by Archbishop Henry of Blaine. But already we can see because we have papal indulgences that only 11 years later, and then again 36 years later, and again later 41 years, that they're having trouble raising money. Right? What is an indulgence? Do we know? An indulgence is when the Pope grants days out of purgatory because you have made a pilgrimage, because you have made a donation. Right? So an indulgence might be at the beginning 10 days out of purgatory, maybe 20 days out of purgatory. And as we move forward in time, we might say that there's a little bit of indulgence inflation. It might be 40, 60, 100, 300 days in purgatory. But when we find that indulgences are being issued, and they can only be issued by the Pope, they're almost always issued for the construction of churches, right, for the work of the Lord, and when money is needed. So within 11 years of the beginning of the work, right, they were needing cash. Well, we've got to imagine, and let me just go back to this image, that underneath this enormous structure, right, it's not just what we see above ground, it's also what's underground. There are enormous foundations that have to support this building, foundations that might actually go 20, 30, 40 feet down in the ground, right? That means an awful lot of labor goes into building a cathedral before it even begins to emerge right above ground level. You have to dig trenches, you have to transport materials, you have to pile them up and cement them together. So the fact that this indulgence happens as early as 1221, someone like me who thinks also about what's below ground as well as what's above, right, is not surprising. But then other things begin to happen. Unfortunately, some kings die, and the coronations of the kings of France take place at Reims Cathedral. Now, I don't suppose many of us have been to a coronation, but they are fantastically elaborate events, right, where the whole nobility of France would gather at Reims, and all the clergy would gather, and there would be enormous pomp and circumstance, and people would stay for weeks on end. And in order to subsidize these great events, right, there would be taxes imposed on the townspeople of Reims by the archbishop. So unfortunately, we have two coronations in quick succession. Louis VIII, who's crowned in 1223, who regrettably dies very young, and his son, Louis IX, who is our St. Louis of Kansas, right? That's going to be him. And he is crowned in 1231. Well, then in a succession of about 7-8 years, we have these two massively elaborate events that put a lot of financial stress on the city and the region. And then to top it all off, 2 years after the coronation of Louis IX, we have Archbishop Henry wanting a percentage of a loan that the burghers of Reims are going to make to 2 other French cities. Right, so these burghers are wealthy. Reims is a very wealthy town. They have these fairs, they're right on the main roads from England to Italy, so all sorts of trades going north. Let's say Italian wine going north in return for English cloth coming south, and then they have champagne, although it hasn't been invented yet, but they must have had the grapes. So, you know, when these burghers are making a loan, the archbishop, who has every right to do this, demands a very high percentage of that loan. Well, people get mad, and they have a riot, and they attack the bishop's palace. They actually take stones from the cathedral and build barricades in the streets against the archbishop and his canon. And in the actual fact, the archbishop and the canons have to take off. They flee the city, and they are gone from 1233 until 1236, when the king and the pope intervene and peace is made. And that peace permits us to build this incredible building, right, which is picked up and completed, because when the canons and the archbishop leave, they can't continue the work. And we just heard that the stones have been used as barricades, so there must have been some chaos and some considerable time. They finished the east end of the church in 1241, so that's 21 years after the work was begun in 1210. And so when we look down the cathedral, this would be the part that was finished by our Archbishop envy of bread. And I'd like to say that Henry kind of had the last word in the big fight with the people of his town. Because when we come in close to the window, and I want to focus on this window right here, we're going to see a remarkably triumphant evocation. Here we have, sorry, it's slightly cropped. Here we have the crucifixion. You just see part of it. The body of Christ, the chalice, Mary and St. John. Here we have the Virgin and Child. I think you can just make out the child. Here we have an image of a cathedral, and here we have a portrait of the bishop, right up there, front and center, right underneath the crucifixion, right in stained glass, miraculously preserved for eternity, but also as a kind of eternal declaration of his power and authority, directly derived right from the power of the holy sacrifice of Christ right above. So I want to end this cathedral with one rather remarkable image, which is not architecture, but it's a painting. And it's a painting that is now in Poland, in the city of Gdansk. It was painted by Hans Memling. And you can see this incredible painting here. It's a picture of the Last Judgment. And here is Christ in majesty. Here is the angel with the scales. Here are the poor souls who have been damned and are going to the mouth of hell. Horrible, fiery mess. But here, on the left side, is this amazing image of those who go to paradise. And where do they go? They go right into the doorway of the cathedral. So I'd like to end with that. And I want to thank you so very much.